Hey everyone, it's Mr. Phantom Knight here, back with another chilling story sent in by one of our brave subscribers. You know how much I love diving into these real-life experiences, especially when they come from our amazing community. Today's story comes from Thomas, who hails from Bend, Oregon. He's about to take us on a terrifying journey down a dark, desolate road that will have you questioning every late-night drive you've ever taken. So, buckle up, turn off the lights, and let's dive into Thomas's eerie encounter. Dear Mr. Phantom Knight, I never considered myself a believer in the paranormal, but what I experienced on a lonely stretch of road one cold winter night shook me to my core. I haven't shared this story with anyone before, but after watching your channel and hearing the stories others have bravely told, I felt it was time to finally get this off my chest. It happened about 3 years ago, on a road trip I took alone. I was driving from my hometown of Bend, Oregon to visit an old friend in Salt Lake City, Utah. It was supposed to be a straight shot, just me, the open road, and some good music. The plan was simple, but as with most things in life, nothing went according to plan. The day had started fine. I'd packed my old Subaru with everything I needed for the trip, and after saying goodbye to my family, I hit the road early in the morning. The first few hours were peaceful, almost therapeutic. The sun was shining, and the sky was a clear, crisp blue. I was looking forward to catching up with my friend, reminiscing about the good old days, and getting away from my everyday routine. But as the day wore on, the weather began to change. The sun dipped behind thick, ominous clouds, and a heavy fog began to settle over the landscape. I'd driven through fog before, but this was different, denser, almost alive. It clung to the car, reducing visibility to just a few feet. The road signs became blurry shadows in the mist, and the tall pines lining the highway seemed to close in, forming a tunnel of darkness around me. I checked my phone for directions, but of course there was no signal. The road ahead was deserted. No cars, no houses. Nothing but an endless stretch of asphalt disappearing into the fog. My GPS had been acting up all day, and now it was completely useless. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, but I brushed it off as paranoia brought on by the eerie atmosphere. After what felt like hours of driving, I finally spotted a small, dimly lit rest stop sign on the side of the road. I decided to pull over and take a break, hoping to wait out the fog and clear my head. The rest stop was barely visible through the thick mist, but I could make out a couple of vending machines, a payphone, and a single, flickering light near the restroom entrance. I parked the car and sat there for a moment, the silence pressing in on me. The fog seemed even thicker here, swirling around the car like it was alive. I could barely see the edges of the parking lot, and the light from the lamppost struggled to pierce through the gloom. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my gut. I got out of the car, the cold air biting at my skin, and made my way to the vending machine. As I fumbled for change, I heard something, faint footsteps, almost imperceptible, but there. I froze, listening intently. The sound stopped. I shook my head, telling myself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal in the woods. I continued to get my drink, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing on end. I decided to use the restroom before getting back on the road. The restroom building was old and run down, with paint peeling off the walls and a door that creaked ominously as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was damp and cold, carrying the scent of mold and something else I couldn't quite place, something metallic, like old blood. The single light bulb flickered overhead, casting long, distorted shadows on the grimy tiles. I did my business quickly, wanting to get out of there as fast as possible. As I washed my hands, the mirror above the sink fogged up, despite the cold. I wiped it with my sleeve, and that's when I saw it, just a brief flash in the mirror behind me. A figure, shadowy and indistinct, standing in the far corner of the restroom. My heart skipped a beat, and I spun around, but the room was empty. Just me and the flickering light. I stood there, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, a reflection or something. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Something was wrong. I grabbed my stuff and bolted out of the restroom, nearly slipping on the wet floor in my haste. Back outside, the fog was even thicker, and the darkness seemed to press in from all sides. The only sound was my own footsteps echoing in the empty lot. I quickly made my way back to the car, glancing over my shoulder more than once. Every time I saw nothing, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking as I unlocked the door and practically threw myself inside. I locked the doors and took a few deep breaths, trying to calm down. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I was letting my imagination get the best of me. But that didn't stop me from feeling like something was out there, just beyond the reach of the headlights, waiting. I turned the key in the ignition, but the car wouldn't start. I tried again, and again, but all I got was the sickening sound of the engine sputtering. Panic set in. I was alone, in the middle of nowhere, with no cell signal and no way to get help. I tried to stay calm, but my mind was racing, filled with images of what might be lurking out there in the fog. I took a deep breath and tried to think logically. Maybe the battery was dead, or the cold had affected the engine. I popped the hood and got out to take a look, hoping it was something simple I could fix. But as I leaned over the engine, the sound of footsteps returned. This time louder, more deliberate, as if someone was walking right up to me. I whipped around, but there was no one there. The fog swirled around me, thick and suffocating. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I felt like I was going to pass out. I slammed the hood shut and got back in the car, locking the doors again. I wasn't about to stay out there any longer. I sat there for what felt like hours, clutching the steering wheel and staring out into the fog. The footsteps had stopped, but the oppressive silence was almost worse. The air in the car was thick with tension, and I felt like I was suffocating. I turned the key one last time, and miraculously, the engine roared to life. I didn't waste any time. I threw the car into gear and sped out of the rest stop, not caring if I was going the right way or not. I just needed to get out of there. As I drove, the fog seemed to part in front of me, revealing the road ahead, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, just out of sight. I didn't stop until I reached a small town about an hour later. I pulled into a gas station and parked under the bright lights, finally feeling a semblance of safety. My hands were still shaking as I got out and went inside to get something to drink. The clerk gave me a strange look, probably wondering why I looked so rattled, but I didn't care. I spent the night in a cheap motel on the edge of town, unable to sleep. Every little noise made me jump, and I kept the lights on all night. The next morning I continued my trip, but I took a different route, avoiding that stretch of road altogether. I never told anyone about what happened, not my friend, not my family. I didn't want them to think I was crazy. But even now, years later, I can't drive at night without thinking about that fog, those footsteps, and the figure I saw in the mirror. I don't know what it was, and maybe I'll never know. All I do know is that something out there was watching me that night, and it wasn't anything human. Thanks for letting me share my story, Mr. Phantom Knight. It feels good to finally get it off my chest, even if I still don't understand what happened. Maybe your other subscribers have had similar experiences. I'd love to hear their thoughts. Stay safe out there, Thomas from Bend, Oregon. Dear Mr. Phantom Knight, I've always enjoyed night drives, but after what happened on that lonely stretch of road outside Boise, I'm not sure I'll ever feel the same about them again. It was a typical Saturday night, and I was on my way back home from a friend's house. The sky was pitch black, with only a sliver of the moon to guide me. I'd taken this road dozens of times before, but that night, something felt off. As I drove, I noticed a figure standing by the side of the road, just barely illuminated by my headlights. At first, I thought it was a hitchhiker, but as I got closer, I could see that the thing, wasn't moving. They were just standing there, completely still, with their back turned to the road. It was strange, but I kept driving, thinking maybe they were waiting for someone. But the further I drove, the more uneasy I felt. It was like there was something in the air, something thick and oppressive, making it hard to breathe. About 10 minutes later, I glanced in my rearview mirror and nearly swerved off the road. The figure was standing in the middle of the road behind me, as if they had just materialized out of thin air. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. I stared into the mirror, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was no way they could have gotten there that fast, not unless they were running at an inhuman speed. I blinked, and suddenly the figure was gone. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white, trying to calm down. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I was tired and seeing things that weren't there. But then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible tapping sound coming from the back seat. My blood ran cold. I didn't want to look, but some morbid curiosity compelled me to glance in the rearview mirror again. What I saw made my heart stop. There was someone, or something, in the back seat, barely visible in the darkness. Their eyes were glowing, staring right at me through the mirror. I felt a scream rise in my throat, but it got stuck there. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even breathe. The figure slowly raised a hand and pressed it against the window, the glass fogging up under its touch. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in terror, but eventually, the thing in the back seat began to fade, like mist evaporating in the morning sun. And just like that, it was gone. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to convince myself that it was all just a bad dream. Eventually, I managed to pull myself together enough to start the car and drive away. But even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that something is still following me. Every time I get in my car, I can't help but glance in the back seat, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me. And I swear, sometimes, I can still hear that faint tapping sound in the dead of night. Thanks for listening to my story. Your name. I hope it serves as a warning to anyone who might think about picking up a hitchhiker on a dark, deserted road. Sometimes, it's better to just keep driving. Dear Mr. Phantom Knight, I'm not usually the kind of person who believes in the supernatural. I've always been more of a skeptic, chalking up strange occurrences to coincidence or just overactive imaginations. But what happened to me last year on a dark, deserted road outside Gainesville, I can't explain it. Even now, I can hardly believe it happened. It was late, probably around 1 a.m., and I was driving back home after visiting a friend. The road I was on was one of those winding back roads that cut through miles of forest, with barely any streetlights to guide the way. It was the kind of road that you wouldn't want to be on unless you absolutely had to be. The night was unusually quiet. No crickets chirping, no rustling in the bushes, just an eerie, all-encompassing silence. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating only a few feet ahead of me as I drove. It was like the rest of the world had disappeared, leaving just me and that narrow stretch of road. As I rounded a bend, I saw something up ahead, a figure standing by the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just someone hitchhiking, but as I got closer, I realized there was something off about them. The person was tall, almost unnaturally so, and they were wearing a long, dark trench coat that seemed to swallow up the light from my headlights. I slowed down as I approached, trying to get a better look. The figure didn't move, didn't wave or make any sign that they needed help. They just stood there, perfectly still, with their back turned to me. My gut told me to keep driving, but something, curiosity maybe, or just plain stubbornness, made me stop. I rolled down my window slightly and called out, "Are you okay? Do you need a ride?" The figure didn't respond. They didn't even turn around. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Something wasn't right. I quickly rolled my window back up and started to drive away, but as I did, the figure suddenly turned to face me. I'll never forget what I saw. The person's face was hidden in shadow, but their eyes were glowing, a sickly yellow that cut through the darkness like headlights. And they were staring right at me, unblinking. I slammed my foot on the gas, my heart pounding in my chest. As I sped away, I glanced in my rearview mirror, expecting to see the figure shrinking into the distance. But instead, they were standing in the middle of the road, perfectly still, those glowing eyes watching me until I turned a corner and lost sight of them. I didn't slow down until I was well past the town limits, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white. I kept looking in the mirror, half expecting to see those yellow eyes staring back at me. When I finally made it home, I was shaking so badly I could hardly get my key in the lock. I rushed inside, slammed the door shut, and double-locked it, as if that would somehow keep the figure away. For the next few days, I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, that my tired mind had played a cruel joke on me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the image of those glowing eyes. I started asking around, wondering if anyone else had seen the figure on that road. Most people just laughed it off, saying it was probably just a trick of the light or my imagination. But then I met an old man at the local diner who told me a story that made my blood run cold. He said that years ago, a man had been killed on that road, hit by a car while walking home late at night. The driver had never stopped, and the man's body wasn't found until the next morning. Since then, there have been stories of a ghostly figure in a trench coat haunting that stretch of road, his eyes glowing in the darkness as he waits for the driver who left him to die. I didn't know what to believe, but I couldn't deny that what I saw matched the old man's story. I've avoided that road ever since, taking the long way home no matter how late it is. But even now I can't help but feel like those glowing eyes are still watching me, waiting for the night when I'll have no choice but to take that road again. Dear Mr. Phantom Knight, I've never been one to scare easily. Growing up in Boulder, Colorado, I spent a lot of time hiking through the woods, camping in the mountains, and driving along deserted roads without a second thought. But something happened to me a few years ago that I can't explain. Something that's left me feeling uneasy every time I find myself alone on the road at night. It was late November, just after Thanksgiving, and I was heading back home after visiting my parents who lived a few hours away. The drive was familiar. I'd taken that route dozens of times before, but that night felt different. The sky was overcast, and a light drizzle was falling, making the road slick and the air heavy with moisture. I was the only car on the road, which wound through a dense forest before eventually opening up into the suburbs of Boulder. The drive had been uneventful, just me and my thoughts, with the occasional song on the radio to break the silence. But about halfway through the trip, I started to feel off. It's hard to describe, but it was like the air around me had suddenly grown colder, and the darkness outside my windows seemed to press in on me, making the inside of my car feel unnervingly small. I shook it off as just my imagination and kept driving, focusing on the road ahead. But then, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a reflection from my taillights. But as I glanced back, I saw a figure sitting in the back seat. My heart skipped a beat. I knew I was alone in the car when I started this trip. I hadn't stopped for gas or food, so there was no way anyone could have gotten in without me noticing. But there it was, a dark silhouette sitting perfectly still in the back seat, its features obscured by shadow. I didn't dare look directly at it, too afraid of what I might see. Instead, I kept my eyes on the road, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I could feel my breath quickening, my chest tightening as panic started to set in. I told myself it wasn't real, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then I heard something, a low, raspy whisper that sent chills down my spine. "Keep driving." The voice was barely audible, but it was enough to send my heart racing. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, and the figure was still there, sitting silently, watching me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was it a hallucination? A figment of my imagination brought on by exhaustion? Or was there someone, in my car? The road ahead seemed to stretch on forever, the trees on either side looming like dark sentinels. I didn't know what to do, pull over and confront whatever was in the back seat, or keep driving and hope that it would just go away. But then the whisper came again, more urgent this time. "Don't stop." My heart pounded in my chest. The logical part of my brain told me to stop the car, get out, and check the back seat. But something deep inside me, some primal instinct, told me that stopping was the worst thing I could do. So I kept driving, my foot pressing harder on the gas pedal as the car sped down the winding road. The rain started to fall harder, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up with the downpour. The road ahead was barely visible, just a blur of wet asphalt and headlights. I could feel my pulse in my temples, my hands slick with sweat as I gripped the wheel. The figure in the back seat didn't move, didn't make a sound. But I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on me, suffocating me with its silent menace. I drove like that for what felt like hours, my mind racing with fear and confusion. But eventually, the road began to straighten out, and the trees gave way to the familiar sight of streetlights and suburban houses. I was getting closer to home, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. As I pulled onto my street, I finally dared to glance back at the rearview mirror. The figure was gone. The back seat was empty, just as it should have been. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by a new wave of fear. Had it been real? Had someone or something actually been in my car? Or was it all just some bizarre hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion? I parked in my driveway and sat there for a moment, my hands still trembling. I couldn't bring myself to get out of the car, too afraid of what might be waiting for me outside. But eventually, I forced myself to move, to get out and lock the car behind me. As I walked up to my front door, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that dark figure standing at the end of the driveway, watching me. But there was nothing, just the quiet, empty street and the soft patter of rain on the pavement. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak, every rustle of the wind outside made me jump, my mind replaying the events of the drive over and over again. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in the car with me, something that wasn't supposed to be there. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself that it was all just a weird hallucination, that my tired brain had conjured up some kind of waking nightmare. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I had felt something in that car with me, something that didn't belong. I started taking a different route home after that, avoiding that dark, winding road through the forest. I didn't care that it added an extra 20 minutes to my drive. I couldn't bring myself to go back there, not after what had happened. Even now, years later, I still get a knot in my stomach when I think about that night. I've told a few people about it, but most of them just laugh it off, saying it was probably just my imagination. But I know what I saw, and I know what I felt. Whatever was in that car with me, it was real. And it was something that I never want to encounter again. Dear Mr. Phantom Knight, I never thought I'd be writing in. But after what happened to me a few months ago, I can't shake the feeling that I need to share this story. Maybe it'll help someone else avoid the same terrifying experience I had. It was late August, and I was driving home from a weekend getaway in Sedona. I live in Flagstaff, so the drive back isn't too long, just over an hour. But I had stayed later than I planned, and by the time I hit the road, it was well past midnight. The highway was empty, just me and the endless stretch of road cutting through the darkened desert. I've always loved driving at night. There's something peaceful about the solitude, the way the world feels quieter, like it's holding its breath. But that night, the stillness felt different, unnerving, almost suffocating. The moon was barely a sliver in the sky, and the stars seemed dimmer than usual, swallowed by the darkness. About halfway through the drive, I noticed something up ahead, a figure standing on the side of the road. At first I thought it was a mirage, a trick of the light, but as I got closer I realized it was a person. A woman, to be exact, standing perfectly still, her back to me, her thumb sticking out in the universal sign of a hitchhiker. I don't usually pick up hitchhikers, it's just not something you do in this day and age, especially not in the middle of the night. But something about her gave me pause. She looked desperate, like she needed help. And as I slowed down to get a better look, I saw that she was barefoot, her clothes torn and dirty. I'm not sure what came over me, but I pulled over and rolled down the window. She didn't move, just stood there with her back to me, her thumb still out. "Hey, do you need a ride?" I called out. For a moment she didn't respond. Then, slowly, she turned to face me. That's when I noticed something was off. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes. There was something wrong with her eyes. They were wide, unblinking, and seemed to shimmer in the dim light, reflecting the glow of my headlights in a way that didn't seem natural. But before I could change my mind and drive off, she stepped forward, reaching for the door handle. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to leave, but I couldn't just drive away. She looked so lost, so vulnerable. So, against my better judgment, I unlocked the door. She slid into the passenger seat without a word, and as soon as she was inside, the temperature in the car seemed to drop by several degrees. I tried to make small talk, asking where she was headed, but she didn't answer. She just stared straight ahead, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The silence between us was heavy, oppressive. I glanced at her out of the corner of my eye, trying to get a read on her, but she was like a statue, completely still, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. After a few minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. The tension was unbearable. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice shaky. She didn't respond, didn't even blink. I was starting to regret my decision to pick her up. Something about her was deeply unsettling, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a terrible mistake. Then, without warning, she turned her head to look at me. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a jolt of fear run through me. There was something in her gaze that I couldn't quite place, something ancient, almost malevolent. "You should have left me where I was," she said, her voice low and hollow. A chill ran down my spine. I tried to keep my composure, but I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to ask her what she meant, but the words wouldn't come. It was like my throat had closed up, the air thick with an invisible force that pressed down on me. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was 0:34 a.m., but it felt like time had slowed to a crawl. The road stretched out endlessly before us, and I realized with growing dread that I had no idea where we were. The familiar landmarks I had passed so many times before were gone, replaced by an empty, featureless landscape. Panic set in. I gripped the steering wheel, trying to stay calm, but my hands were shaking. I needed to get out of this nightmare, but I didn't know how. "You can't leave," she said suddenly, as if reading my thoughts. "Not until it's over." My heart skipped a beat. "What's over?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the road, her expression unreadable. I could feel the tension in the car ratchet up, the air growing thick with an oppressive energy that made it hard to breathe. I had to get out of there. I had to get away from her. But every time I thought about pulling over and telling her to get out, a wave of fear washed over me, paralyzing me in my seat. I don't know how long we drove like that, minutes, hours, days. Time had lost all meaning. All I knew was that I had to keep going, keep driving, until, what? Until she decided it was over? Until we reached some unknown destination. Suddenly, she spoke again, her voice softer this time. "It's coming." I swallowed hard, my mouth dry as sandpaper. "What's coming?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. She didn't reply, just kept staring straight ahead, her eyes wide and unblinking. I followed her gaze, and that's when I saw it. Something up ahead in the distance, a dark shape moving toward us on the road. I couldn't make out what it was, but it was huge, towering over the road like a giant shadow. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, shifting and undulating as it came closer. "What the hell is that?" I whispered, more to myself than to her, but she heard me. "You shouldn't have picked me up," she said, her voice barely audible. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I wanted to believe it was just a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination. But the closer it got, the more real it became. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The road was empty again, the dark shape vanished as if it had never been there. I blinked, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Had I imagined the whole thing? Was I losing my mind? I turned to the woman, desperate for some kind of explanation, but she was gone. The passenger seat was empty, the door still locked. I hadn't heard it open, hadn't felt the car shift as she left. It was as if she had simply disappeared into thin air. I slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a screeching halt. My hands were trembling, my heart racing as I looked around, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there was nothing, no sign of her, no sign of the dark shape on the road. Just the empty highway stretching out before me, bathed in the eerie light of the moon. I sat there for a long time, my mind reeling, before finally gathering the courage to drive again. I didn't look back, didn't check the rearview mirror. I just wanted to get home, to get away from whatever had just happened. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon. I sat in the car for a few minutes, trying to steady my breathing, before finally getting out and heading inside. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, heard her voice telling me I shouldn't have picked her up, and that dark shape on the road. What was it? Where did it go? To this day, I don't have any answers. I've tried to rationalize it, tell myself it was just a dream, a hallucination brought on by fatigue. But deep down, I know it was real. I know that I encountered something on that road that night, something beyond my understanding. I haven't driven that route since. In fact, I avoid driving at night altogether. The memory of that night is still too fresh, too vivid in my mind. And every now and then, when I'm alone in my house late at night, I think I can hear her voice again, whispering to me in the dark. Dear Mr. Phantom Knight, I'm writing to you because I can't seem to get this experience out of my head. It happened a few months ago, but the memory is as vivid as if it were yesterday. I don't know if anyone will believe me, but I need to get this off my chest. Maybe sharing it will help me make sense of what happened. It was a typical Saturday night. I had been visiting my parents in a small town outside of Asheville, North Carolina, and was heading back home after a weekend of family dinners and catching up. I left their house around midnight, knowing the drive back would take me about an hour. The route I took was straightforward, a well-traveled road that I knew like the back of my hand. It was dark, but that was normal for this time of year. The moon was obscured by clouds, leaving the road illuminated only by my headlights. Everything seemed routine until I noticed a flickering light up ahead. At first, I thought it was just a car in the distance, but as I got closer, I realized it was a single, dim light source on the side of the road. I couldn't see what it was, but it seemed unusual, almost out of place. I slowed down to get a better look, and saw what appeared to be an old-fashioned lantern, the kind you might see in a period drama. It was hanging from a post beside the road, casting a soft, eerie glow. I was puzzled because there was nothing around it. No houses, no buildings, just an empty stretch of road and the dense forest on either side. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to pull over. I parked the car a safe distance away and stepped out, the chill of the night air hitting me immediately. I approached the lantern, and as I got closer, I saw that it was hanging from a rusty old signpost. The sign itself was too faded to read, but the lantern's light cast long, dancing shadows on the road. I was about to reach out and inspect the lantern when I heard a noise behind me, a crunching sound like footsteps on gravel. I turned around quickly, but there was no one there. The forest was still and silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I shrugged it off as a trick of the night and turned back to the lantern. As I reached out to touch it, the light flickered and went out. I frowned and tried to relight it, but it wouldn't catch. It was as if the flame had been snuffed out by an unseen force. Just then, I heard the footsteps again, closer this time. I turned around, my heart pounding in my chest, but still saw no one. The shadows in the forest seemed to move, almost as if they were watching me. I decided it was time to leave. I got back in my car and started driving again, but the uneasy feeling didn't go away. The night seemed darker, the road less familiar. Every so often, I would glance in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something following me. A few miles down the road, I saw another light in the distance. It was the same kind of lantern hanging from a post beside the road. My heart sank. I was sure I had left the previous lantern behind, and now here was another one in exactly the same style. I slowed down again, my nerves on edge. The road was empty, but this lantern was in a different location, still in the middle of nowhere. I parked the car again, this time feeling a cold sweat forming on my back. I approached the lantern, and just like before, it went out as I got close. I stepped back, my mind racing. I felt a presence, a feeling that I was being watched, but I couldn't see anything. The lantern's light was gone, leaving me in complete darkness. I decided that enough was enough. I got back in my car and drove as fast as I could, my eyes darting to every shadow and movement in the trees. I could still hear those footsteps, getting closer with every mile I drove. It was like something or someone was chasing me, keeping pace with my car. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the first light of dawn was just breaking. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I didn't get much sleep that night, and every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing those lanterns flickering in the dark. I still drive that road occasionally, but I never see the lanterns again. It's as if they were never there. But every time I pass that stretch of highway, I can't help but feel a shiver run down my spine, and I keep my eyes peeled for any signs of the mysterious lights. I don't know what I experienced that night, whether it was a trick of the mind or something more sinister. All I know is that it felt real, and it left me with an unsettling feeling that I can't shake. Thanks for listening, and I hope that by sharing this I can finally put this experience to rest. Sincerely, Lily. Dear Mr. Phantom Knight, I've hesitated to share this, but after hearing other stories on your channel, I feel like it's time to come forward with my own experience. What happened to me a few months ago was so unsettling that it still gives me chills whenever I think about it. I hope by sharing this I can make some sense of what occurred. It all started on an ordinary Friday evening. I had planned to visit my friend Emily, who had recently moved into an old house on the outskirts of Seattle. She was hosting a small get-together with a few close friends, and I was looking forward to catching up. Emily had been excited about her new place, and I was curious to see it for myself. The drive to Emily's house was uneventful. It was a crisp, clear night, and I took in the quiet scenery as I traveled along the winding roads leading to her home. The house was located at the end of a long gravel driveway surrounded by dense woods. It had an old-world charm with its Victorian architecture and overgrown garden, but I didn't think much of it at the time. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was how quiet everything seemed. The trees surrounding the property were so dense that they blocked out most of the moonlight, casting the area in a gloomy darkness. Emily greeted me warmly, and we chatted for a while before heading inside to join the other guests. The interior of the house was just as charming as the outside. It was furnished with antique pieces and decorated in a vintage style. The atmosphere was cozy and welcoming, with soft lighting and the smell of home-cooked food filling the air. The evening went on pleasantly, with laughter and conversation flowing freely among the group. Around midnight, as the party began to wind down, Emily suggested we take a walk around the property. The fresh night air seemed like a good idea, and a few of us agreed. We ventured outside, with Emily leading us down a path that she had recently cleared through the woods. The path led to a small clearing with an old stone well in the center. Emily explained that the well was there when she moved in, and she had heard some strange stories about it from the locals. She didn't believe in the superstitions, but thought it was interesting nonetheless. As we stood around the well, the conversation took a darker turn. One of the guests, Mark, started sharing some local legends about the area. He talked about disappearances and strange occurrences that had happened over the years. The stories were unsettling, but we laughed them off as tall tales. The group eventually started to disperse, and Emily and I stayed behind to talk. We were enjoying the quiet when I noticed something strange. From the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow moving in the trees. I turned to look, but there was nothing there. I dismissed it as a trick of the light and continued our conversation. A few minutes later, Emily excused herself to go back inside and get some snacks. I decided to wait for her by the well. It was then that I heard it, a faint sound coming from the direction of the house. It was a soft, rhythmic thumping, like someone knocking on a door or a heavy object being moved. I assumed it was just the house settling or perhaps Emily moving something around. But as the sound continued, I began to feel uneasy. The thumping grew louder and more erratic, as if something, or someone, was moving around inside the house in a hurry. I tried to call out to Emily, but my voice was swallowed by the surrounding darkness. I walked back toward the house, hoping to find out what was going on. As I approached the back door, the thumping abruptly stopped. I hesitated before stepping inside, but the house was eerily quiet. I made my way through the darkened rooms, calling out for Emily, but there was no response. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each step I took. I reached the kitchen and found nothing out of the ordinary, but the back door was ajar. My unease turned to alarm when I noticed that some of the items on the kitchen counter had been moved around. I didn't remember seeing the kitchen this disheveled earlier, and it seemed out of place. I closed the door and started to search the rest of the house, but everything appeared normal. As I was about to head upstairs, I heard a noise coming from the basement. It sounded like something or someone was shuffling around down there. I froze, my heart racing. The basement door was partially open, and a cold draft was seeping through. I debated whether or not to investigate, but my concern for Emily pushed me forward. I slowly descended the stairs, the creaking steps echoing in the otherwise silent house. The basement was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. I could see boxes and old furniture piled in the corners. The noise grew louder as I reached the bottom of the stairs. It was a scraping sound, like metal against concrete. I approached the source of the noise and found an old metal shelf that had been moved. It was blocking a door that led to a small storage room. I hesitated before moving the shelf aside. As I opened the door, I was met with a rush of cold air. The room was filled with old furniture and dusty boxes, but nothing seemed out of place. I took a deep breath and turned to leave when I noticed something odd. There was a small, dark shape on the floor near the back of the room. It looked like a bundle of rags or a piece of cloth. I reached down to pick it up and was startled to find that it was a tattered old blanket. I unfolded it and saw something that made my blood run cold. A single dirty photograph of a woman. The woman in the photograph looked familiar, but I couldn't place her. She had a sad, distant expression, and the background of the photo was a vintage-looking room that matched the decor of Emily's house. I was about to examine the photograph further when I heard a loud crash from upstairs. I rushed back up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The noise had come from the direction of the living room. When I arrived, I found the room in disarray, furniture overturned, and objects scattered across the floor. Emily was standing in the middle of the chaos, looking disoriented and frightened. I rushed over to her and asked what had happened. She explained that she had come back downstairs and found the room in the state I saw it. She hadn't heard any noise or seen anything unusual. We checked the rest of the house, but everything else seemed normal. We decided to call it a night, and I left soon after. The drive home was tense, and I kept looking in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me. I didn't see anything unusual, but the sense of unease stayed with me for the rest of the night. In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I researched the history of Emily's house and discovered that it had been built in the early 1900s. There were no records of anything unusual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Emily eventually moved out of the house, citing a series of odd occurrences that made her uncomfortable. She never went into detail, but she mentioned that she had experienced similar disturbances after I left that night. I still think about that night and the strange events that unfolded. The photograph, the noises, and the disarray of the living room all point to something beyond explanation. I don't know what we encountered that night, but it left me with an unsettling feeling that I can't ignore. Thanks for listening to my story. I hope it helps others who have experienced similar things. Sometimes, the unknown is scarier than we can imagine, and it's best to heed our instincts when something doesn't feel right. Sincerely, Jacob. Dear Mr. Phantom Knight, I've been a fan of your channel for quite some time and have always admired how you bring real-life experiences to light. I never thought I'd be writing to share my own story, but what happened to me recently was so unnerving that I felt compelled to get it off my chest. I hope my story resonates with others who have had similar experiences. It started on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. I was working from home that day, a routine that had become increasingly normal for me since the pandemic. My apartment is located in a quiet neighborhood in Denver, surrounded by well-maintained homes and manicured lawns. It's a pleasant area, and nothing unusual ever happens. That day, as I was finishing up a project for work, the doorbell rang. It was an unusual time for a delivery, and I didn't recall ordering anything. When I opened the door, I was met with a delivery package on the doorstep. It was a small, unmarked box, with no indication of its sender. The only thing that caught my attention was a handwritten note attached to the top. The note simply read, "To the new tenant, please handle with care." There was no return address, no sender's information, nothing but the cryptic message. I shrugged it off as a prank or a mistake, and brought the box inside, placing it on the kitchen counter. I was curious about the contents, but I had work to finish, so I left it alone for the time being. Later that evening, after I had wrapped up my tasks, I decided to open the box. Inside, I found an old leather-bound journal and a small, antique-looking key. The journal was filled with handwritten notes, sketches, and what appeared to be personal observations. The key had an old-fashioned design, and it was tarnished with age. The first few entries in the journal were mundane, detailing everyday life and the writer's observations about their surroundings. But as I read further, I began to notice a shift in tone. The entries grew darker, filled with disturbing descriptions of strange occurrences and unsettling events. The author wrote about hearing footsteps in the middle of the night, seeing shadowy figures in the corners of their vision, and feeling a constant sense of being watched. One entry stood out to me. "The key is important. It unlocks something that should remain hidden. Be wary of what you find." My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate the key. I searched through my apartment, looking for any locks or doors that might fit it. There was nothing obvious, so I started to wonder if it was meant for a different location. That night, I began to hear noises. It started with faint scratching sounds coming from the walls. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was just the house settling. But the sounds grew louder and more persistent. They seemed to come from the direction of the closet in my bedroom. I tried to get some sleep, but the noises kept me awake. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A low, guttural whisper. It was almost as if someone was speaking right next to me, but when I looked around, I was alone. The next day, I decided to take a closer look at the journal and the key. I examined the sketches and found that many of them depicted the interior of my apartment. There were drawings of the rooms, including details that were accurate to the layout of the place. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me for a long time. As evening approached, I felt a growing sense of unease. The noises continued, and I was unable to pinpoint their source. I started to doubt my own sanity, questioning whether I was imagining things. I reached out to a friend and told them about the journal and the key, but they dismissed it as an elaborate prank. That night, I decided to try and sleep with the lights on. I left the journal on the kitchen counter and placed the key next to it, hoping that it would provide some clarity. But as I drifted off, I was jolted awake by a loud bang coming from the kitchen. I rushed out of bed and found the journal and key scattered on the floor. The pages of the journal were flipped open to a particular entry. "The key is not meant to be used. It will reveal things that should remain hidden." I picked up the journal and noticed that the key was missing. Panic set in as I searched the apartment for the key. I checked every drawer, every cabinet, and every nook and cranny. It was nowhere to be found. The scratching noises had intensified, and the whispers grew louder. I could no longer ignore the feeling that something was terribly wrong. In a desperate attempt to find the key, I decided to check the basement. The apartment building had a shared basement, which was mostly used for storage. I had never been down there before, but I figured it was worth a try. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way down the creaky stairs. The basement was dimly lit, with flickering overhead lights casting eerie shadows on the walls. The air was musty and cold, and the silence was oppressive. As I walked through the maze of storage units, I felt a sense of dread that grew with each step. I searched the basement thoroughly, but there was no sign of the key. Just as I was about to give up, I heard a noise behind me. It was a faint, rhythmic tapping sound. I turned around and saw a shadowy figure moving quickly through the darkness. My heart raced as I chased after the figure, but it vanished into thin air. I stood there, panting and disoriented, wondering if my mind was playing tricks on me. The tapping sound continued, growing louder and more erratic. I stumbled upon an old, dusty storage unit that was slightly ajar. I hesitated before opening it, but the urge to find the key overpowered my fear. Inside, I found an old wooden chest. The chest was locked, but it had a keyhole that looked like it might fit the key I had lost. I rummaged through the storage unit and found an old key ring with several keys on it. One of the keys looked like it might fit the chest. With trembling hands, I inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The chest creaked open, revealing its contents. Inside the chest were various old items, photographs, letters, and a few peculiar artifacts. Among them was a journal that looked identical to the one I had found earlier. I flipped through the pages and discovered that it contained more detailed accounts of the disturbances described in the journal I had received. The entries described a series of unsettling events that had occurred in the apartment over the years. There were accounts of previous tenants experiencing similar phenomena, including strange noises, objects moving on their own, and an overwhelming feeling of being watched. I realized that the journal I had received was not a prank, but a continuation of a long history of unsettling occurrences in the apartment. The key was meant to lead me to the truth, but it seemed that something was determined to keep that truth hidden. I returned to my apartment with a heavy heart and an even heavier sense of dread. The noises had ceased, but the feeling of unease remained. I decided to move out of the apartment shortly after, unable to shake the feeling that something sinister was connected to that place. I don't know what I encountered during my time in that apartment, but the experience left a lasting impression on me. Sometimes I wonder if the shadows and whispers were just figments of my imagination, or if there was something more sinister at play. Either way, I'm glad to have left that chapter behind. Thank you for taking the time to read my story. I hope it offers some insight into the unknown, and perhaps provides some comfort to those who have experienced similar situations. Sincerely, Emma. Dear Mr. Phantom Knight, I've been following your channel for a while now and have always found the stories captivating. I never thought I'd be writing to share my own, but what happened to me recently was so bizarre and unsettling that I felt it was necessary to reach out. I hope my experience adds to the collection of real-life horrors and resonates with others who might have faced something similar. It all started on a late summer evening. I had been on a long road trip across Idaho heading back to Boise after visiting some old friends in the small town of Wallace. The journey was peaceful and uneventful, with nothing out of the ordinary until I reached the outskirts of a remote area around midnight. I had planned to drive straight through to Boise, but exhaustion got the better of me. I decided to pull over at a rest stop along a secluded stretch of highway. It was a typical roadside area, with a small parking lot, a few picnic tables, and an old, weathered restroom building. There was no one else around, and the silence was almost absolute. The moonlight cast eerie shadows across the area, giving it an unsettling atmosphere. I parked my car and took a quick walk to stretch my legs. The rest stop was surrounded by dense trees and tall grass, which added to the sense of isolation. I decided to use the restroom before continuing my drive, but as I approached the building, I noticed something odd. The door to the restroom was slightly ajar, even though it was clearly closed when I arrived. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open. The interior was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb, and it smelled musty. As I made my way inside, I noticed a strange feeling of unease creeping over me. It was as if the space was somehow off. I chalked it up to the fact that it was late, and I was alone in a remote location. After using the facilities, I headed back to my car. As I reached the parking lot, I heard a noise coming from the nearby trees. It sounded like someone or something was moving through the underbrush. I looked around, but saw nothing unusual. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. I got back into my car and started the engine, hoping that the noise was just an animal or some other benign cause. However, as I pulled out of the rest stop and back onto the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence of the night seemed almost oppressive, and the road ahead was shrouded in darkness. About 15 minutes later, I noticed something strange. The road I was on seemed to change. It began to twist and turn in ways that didn't match the map on my phone. I checked my GPS, but it showed that I was still on the same highway. The landscape around me started to look unfamiliar, despite the fact that I had been on this road many times before. As I drove on, I saw signs that were different from the ones I remembered. The mile markers were inconsistent, and the exits seemed to lead nowhere. The road appeared to stretch endlessly, with no visible landmarks or familiar points of reference. The eerie silence was occasionally broken by the distant sound of what seemed like muffled voices, but I couldn't make out any distinct words. Panic began to set in as I realized that I was lost in a place that shouldn't exist. The familiar highway had turned into a maze of twisting roads and unrecognizable terrain. I tried turning around and retracing my steps, but every turn seemed to lead me deeper into the labyrinth. I decided to stop and try to figure out my location. I pulled over to the side of the road and got out of my car, hoping to get a better sense of my surroundings. As I stood there, I noticed that the trees seemed to close in around me, and the darkness grew even more oppressive. The muffled voices grew louder, though I still couldn't make out what they were saying. Suddenly, I heard a loud thud coming from behind me. I spun around and saw nothing but the dark forest and the dimly lit road. My heart raced as I got back into my car and locked the doors. I was terrified and desperate to get out of the area. I continued driving, hoping to find an exit or a familiar landmark. The road continued to twist and turn, and the eerie voices seemed to follow me. I could feel the tension mounting as I drove deeper into the darkness. The strange road seemed to have no end, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing minute. After what felt like hours, I finally saw a dim light in the distance. I drove toward it, hoping it was a sign of civilization. As I approached, I saw that it was a small, run-down gas station with flickering lights. I pulled into the parking lot and got out of the car, relieved to see another human being. I approached the gas station attendant, who was a middle-aged man with a tired expression. I explained my situation and asked for directions back to the main highway. The attendant listened to my story with a puzzled look, then handed me a map and gave me directions. He seemed strangely familiar with the area, though he didn't provide many details about the road I had been on. He simply said, "It's easy to get lost out there. Just follow the signs and you'll find your way back." I thanked him and got back into my car, following his directions. The road gradually became more familiar, and I eventually found my way back to the highway. The strange road I had been on seemed to disappear behind me, and I was relieved to be back on familiar ground. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The experience left me with a deep sense of unease and a lingering question: what had happened on that road? Why did it seem to exist in a different reality? I've never been able to fully explain the experience, and I haven't returned to that rest stop since. It's as if that stretch of highway had its own set of rules, and I had stumbled into a place that was not meant to be found. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that there is something lurking just beyond the edge of reality, waiting for someone to stumble into its grasp. Thank you for taking the time to read my story. I hope it provides some insight into the inexplicable and perhaps serves as a cautionary tale for those who venture into the unknown. Sincerely, Michael. Dear Mr. Phantom Knight, I've been a follower of your channel for quite some time now, and I've always been captivated by the stories you share. I never imagined that I would have a story of my own to contribute, but something happened recently that left me shaken to my core. I hope my experience adds to the chilling collection of real-life encounters that you feature. It was a balmy summer evening when it all began. I had been working late at the office in Charleston and decided to take the scenic route home to unwind. The day had been particularly stressful, and the idea of a long drive through the countryside seemed like a perfect way to clear my mind. I had heard about a forgotten service road that ran parallel to the main highway, rumored to offer a quiet escape from the usual hustle and bustle. I decided to take it, seeking solace in the calm of the rural landscape. The service road was a narrow, unpaved path flanked by tall trees and dense underbrush. It had been a while since I'd traveled this route, and it looked just as I remembered, neglected and overgrown. The shadows of the trees created eerie patterns on the road, and the occasional rustle of leaves made me feel uneasy. But I pushed aside my apprehensions, focusing on the tranquility that this isolated road promised. As I drove deeper into the road, the light from my headlights struggled to penetrate the thick canopy of trees. The narrow path twisted and turned, and the darkness seemed to grow more oppressive with every bend. I found myself glancing in the rearview mirror more often than usual, feeling an inexplicable sense of being watched. Despite my attempts to calm myself, a persistent feeling of unease gnawed at me. About 20 minutes into the drive, I noticed a dilapidated wooden sign partially obscured by overgrown vines. It read, "End of Service Road." I was puzzled, as I had expected the road to continue a bit further. But since I was already committed to the path, I decided to keep going. The road narrowed even more, and the dense foliage seemed to press in on all sides. Suddenly the engine sputtered and the headlights flickered. My heart raced as I struggled to keep the car moving. The road ahead was almost completely dark, with only the faintest glimmer of moonlight seeping through the trees. My anxiety escalated, and I could hear the sound of my own breathing growing louder. The car finally stalled, and the engine died with a final sputter. I tried to restart the car, but the engine refused to turn over. A feeling of dread settled over me, and I decided to get out and investigate. The air outside was stifling, and the darkness seemed almost tangible. I used my phone's flashlight to illuminate the immediate area, revealing an old, rusted gate hidden among the trees. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached the gate. It was locked with a heavy chain and padlock. I shone my flashlight through the gaps, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Beyond the gate was a small, overgrown cemetery, with weathered headstones barely visible in the gloom. The graves were arranged in haphazard rows, as if they had been forgotten and abandoned long ago. A sudden, sharp rustling sound behind me made me spin around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I saw nothing but the oppressive blackness of the forest. My pulse quickened, and I tried to calm my racing heart. I turned back to the gate, only to find that the rustling sound had grown louder. It was as if someone, or something, was moving through the underbrush. The flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the cemetery. I could hear soft whispers carried by the wind, though I couldn't make out any coherent words. I felt a chill crawl down my spine, and an overwhelming sense of being observed washed over me. I quickly returned to my car, desperate to leave. Just as I was about to get in, the car's headlights flickered back on, and the engine roared to life as if by some miracle. I wasted no time and drove away as fast as I could, not daring to look back. The oppressive darkness of the service road seemed to close in on me, and the whispering voices grew fainter but no less unsettling. When I finally reached the main highway, I pulled over to catch my breath. I was shaken, and my hands trembled as I tried to steady myself. The experience on that forgotten road has haunted me ever since. I have no explanation for what I encountered, but I know one thing for sure: I'll never drive down that road again. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it finds a place among the eerie tales you share. Sincerely, Amy. I want to thank you all for joining me on this haunting journey through the dark roads. We've just wrapped up 10 spine-chilling stories, each one a unique and unsettling encounter from our brave subscribers. From eerie service roads to unsettling back roads, These stories remind us that sometimes the scariest things are the ones that linger just beyond our field of vision. I hope these tales have kept you on the edge of your seat and given you a glimpse into the unsettling and unexplained. Your support and feedback mean the world to me, and I'm thrilled to share these real-life experiences with you. If you've enjoyed these stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on our latest content. And if you have your own eerie tales to share, feel free to send them in. Your story could be featured in an upcoming video. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and remember, the darkness may hide many secrets, but together, we'll uncover them. Stay safe, and see you soon.